Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 6 of Life, Love, God, the story of a soul traveler, the autobiography of Norman Paulsen, who founded Sunburst and also was a direct disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda. So, we're going to start out today in chapter 5, which is called My Search Begins for the Face of God. And the chapter starts out with Norman asking his grandmother a question about who has seen God. And Norman says, "Please tell me, Nana, if anyone has ever seen God." And Nana replied, "It is written in the scriptures that a man named Moses saw God face to face in a burning bush." In fact, if we read further along in the book of Exodus in the Old Testament, it says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses face to face, as a man speaketh unto his friend." This was a thrilling discovery for Norman. And he described it. He said, "There was an undying thrill and desire that was rising up within me to move onward and outward, never to diminish in this life." And that thrill and desire was his search for the face of God. And it had officially begun when he heard about Moses. And he said, in his own words, "Moses became the first God-inspired image to enter my life." So Nana suggests taking Norman to Sunday school class for the first time. And during one of these classes, Norm asked his Sunday school teacher about Moses seeing God face to face. And his teacher gave him an answer that made absolutely no sense to him. And later at home, Norm said, "I don't like Sunday school. I don't want to go anymore." "Well, why don't you like Sunday school?" Nana asked. And Norm answered, "Because nobody there really knows what they're talking about." And then Charles spoke up. "Norman doesn't have to go anymore. The blind can't lead the blind, as the master said, or both fall into the same ditch." So here we see Charles supporting his son in his great mission, and knowing that if Norm doesn't see what he's looking for here, then maybe we should go a little bit lighter on Norman and not force him to go to Sunday school. Because if they can't answer his questions and he's got better questions and they have answers, there's a problem there. And then right after this, for the second time, Melchizedek guides Norman. And he hears Melchizedek's voice, and he says, "It's the same voice that I heard in the library." And he said, "You must walk in a circle, Norman, around the outside of the church, and then you'll know all things." In other words, in a metaphor, you're not going to find what you're looking for inside the church. What you seek is going to be outside of organized religion. So in 1956, Cecil B. DeMille's second film, The Ten Commandments, is released, starring Charlton Heston. That movie had a great impact on a lot of people, including myself, because as a family, we watched it every year for probably the first 10 or 12 years of my life. And this is a scene from the movie where he's on Mount Horeb, and he's working as a shepherd. He's been exiled from Egypt as the Pharaoh's favorite son, and he's married a shepherd girl, and he's watching the flocks near the foot of Mount Horeb when he sees a strange light up on the mountain. And he climbed up the mountain, and when he got to this strange light, he saw a burning bush that was burning but was never consumed. And out of the midst of that bush, he heard God's voice say, "Moses, Moses, put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground." And they conversed as a friend talks to another. And Moses was given, well, first of all, was given a serpent, and that serpent changed into a staff of power. And then he instructed him to take his staff and his brother Aaron and return to Egypt to free the rest of the Israelites that were still in captivity in Egypt. And Moses asked God a question, which I think a lot of those Israelites would want to know. It's like, if you return to Egypt and you tell people we're gonna leave Egypt, it's like, and God told me this. They're gonna want to know, what God, what's his name, what should I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am that I am. Tell them I am hath sent me unto you. So Moses successfully, through the plagues that God sent upon Egypt, he was able to free the Israelites from Egyptian captivity and take them into the desert. At Mount Sinai, Moses climbed the mountain and received the 10 Commandments from God. It is written that when he returned to his people after meeting with God on the mountain, he carried the stone tablets written by God, and his face shone brightly with a bright light, and the people were afraid to come near him. In fact, they asked him to put a veil over his face. Well, the shining on Moses' face occurred as a result of his complete illumination. It was the result of God realization from being in the direct presence, face to face with God. The realization that God was alive and that Moses had seen him thrilled Norman, as it has thrilled millions of people since this happened, inspiring a lifetime search for the face of God. Now, there's some interesting stories in this chapter where Norm is being aided by people outside the realm of our physical world. In second grade, Norman was the only boy in class with long hair, and this caused him to be teased in school and to be called a sissy. To add to this unwanted attention, Norman's family required him to wear a white shirt and a tie to school each day, as he was the son of a judge. So almost every day, these ruffians, or what Norm wrote, called them town toughies, in Norman's school, there was about 10 or 12 of them. They'd chase him on his way home so they could catch him and humiliate him, even beat up on him. And one day the chase began as usual, but this time Spirit shouted in Norman's ears, "Stop running, turn around and chase them." And he turned around and shouted with such force that the toughies turned around and ran and never bothered Norman again. Another example of Father, Mother, God overlooking the growth and development of Norman because he had great things to do. So one day, Norman sees his dad walking home from the office, and Norm decided to test him. So he hid himself along the edge of the sidewalk, thinking that Charles would walk right past him, not knowing he was there. And as Charles began to pass, he turned toward Norman and said, "Thought you could fool your old dad, did you? You know better than that." You see, Charles had an extended awareness all the time, and he had the ability to see without physical eyes. So in a newspaper article from Pasadena, Charles explained how he was able to see without physical eyes through increased hearing as well as inner sight. That increased hearing is probably very similar to what we think of when we think of bats, basically knowing where their food is and where they are based on the echo or the sound that would come back to them when they send out a signal. The Pasadena newspaper wrote a large article about him when he was studying concert piano in Pasadena, and they said that Charles could hear walls and buildings and water and curbs by how the sounds bounced off those surfaces. He also explained to Harry Houdini when he came to town that he also received impressions or images that mentally helped him to navigate around the world. He said, "I'm led by the force of life, which is everywhere and in all things." So basically, he was being led by life force. He was being led by spirit. He was being led by eyes that don't need uh, uh, physical sight. So before Norm was born, Harry Houdini came to town, and he performed in the Lompoc Theater. And Charles and Harry Houdini had struck up a friendship. Charles had walked Houdini all over Lompoc, showing him his office and the theater and the different sites. And finally, Houdini asked Charles, "You must be able to see a little." And Charles answered, "Harry, I physically can't see a damn thing. I never have been able to." You see, Charles was born with cataracts, and as a result of the cataracts and not being able to treat them in those days, he started his life out blind and ended it blind. So Houdini replied, because he'd seen him do all these miraculous things going around town without physical eyes. He said, "I'll bet you can't drive a car, Charlie." So the next day, Charles drove Houdini and Norm's mother 4 blocks away from the house, returning to their home and successfully parking the car. And Charles turned to Houdini and said, "So how did you like that, Harry? Now pay up." This chapter was a short chapter, but I think that one of the reasons why this chapter even exists is to show the many times that Norman received support as a young guy to carry out his mission in this life. His father supported him in many ways. When he didn't want to go to Sunday school, his father said he doesn't have to go to Sunday school. Why let the blind lead the blind? Melchizedek appeared to him the second time and basically said, "You're not going to find the answer inside the church. You're not going to find the answers of what you're looking for in organized religion. You're going to have to walk around the churches and find it elsewhere." And then we have Spirit for the first time speaking directly to Norman and telling him how to deal with the ruffians. So if I was going to rename this chapter, it would be how Norm was supported as a young man to fulfill his mission. So for next month, we're going to read chapter 6, The Train Ride to San Francisco. So I'd like to have you read that before we meet next week. I hope you got something out of today's class and that you continue reading Life, Love, God. Thank you.